Good afternoon to everybody. We will again switch to the conference, and now the presentators will be Katja Kobolt and Natša Petrešin-Bachalez, which is right up there with me. Let me say a few words about Nataša, just to introduce her. She's an interdependent curator, editor, and writer. She was co-director of Le Laboratoire d'Aubervilliers. She's chief editor of Verapolis Review and was chief editor of the Manifesta Journal from 2000 to 2014, and of L'Internationale Online from 2014 to 2017. With Elena Sorokina, she is the co-founder of the Initiative for Practices and Visions of Radical Care. And the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Maja. So I'm very honored to take part of this gathering, of this assembly in honor of magazine Maska. My dear colleagues and friends before me were being quite personal when they started with their presentations. And I would also like to say that I have encountered Maska in 92, 93, thanks to my sister, who bought those issues that I also, like Pia was saying, I couldn't really understand what was happening, but I understood that something is happening there. So I grew up very much with a kind of awe and admiration of the discourse and the environment that this magazine was creating. At that time, I was still a teenager in a gymnasium, in a high school. And I think it influenced me a lot to actually decide then for my studies, which was studies on the Filozofska fakulteta. And I had the pleasure, if I remember correctly, my contribution for the first time was in 2004 with a very regretted and dear colleague of ours, Igor Zabil, and with theoretician and writer Brian Holmes and Claire Pentecost, an artist, and Marco Pilhan, an artist that I worked a lot with. We discussed about the strategies of resistance, and it was an interview that kind of really grounded my ways of thinking and working as a young curator at that time. So thank you for taking care of this magazine until now in such an important way. And I hope that we meet in 100 years in some kind of bionic, extended, augmented life versions of ourselves again. I was going to also thank the previous conversation between Bojana Cvejić and Bojana Kunst, because much has been opened up in the discussion about the terms and the practices of care in regards to our contemporary moment, the way we are situating ourselves, where we are speaking from on one hand, but mostly when we are speaking from, so in the present moment, which is so concerned about these notions. But most specifically, I will talk from a very actual moment of me trying to understand what I can do as somebody who is working as a curator since some time now, and having this, let's say, education on one side, having the potential of the word curator as somebody who takes care or is a custodian either of objects or subjects in the relationship with the artists and institutions in which she or he intervenes. But at the other hand, I'm coming from a legacy where the impetus of internationalization was such that this was replaced as a kind of myth of networking and demand, absolute demand of mobility and flexibility, which I think we heard a lot also already today and yesterday about this flexible subject and how this was manifested also in the performing arts. But I'm trying to reflect actually on the current practice that I'm developing in Paris together with a colleague of mine, and I will go a little bit more into details because it comes after a certain. We heard the word disappointment today, so I also lived through a disappointment last year. At the same time, it was a disappointment as it was through another project, actually a great fulfillment of what I can do as a curator. I will just briefly remain on that, but more specifically, I will try to speak about the necessity to rethink curatorial practice and curatorial relationships or making within the term of interdependence on one side. So as you could hear from my bio, I humbly describe myself as interdependent curator. I'm not independent. I never actually perceived that I was. And I also believe that the independent, so-called independent scene is very much an interdependent scene. So in the Slovene it would be soodvisnja, kustosinja, and how this interdependence relates on one side to the notion of care, of course, but also to certain process of rehumanization, because I have been working a lot on since last years on the notions of dehumanization through, on one hand, racialization processes in social aspects of relations between institutions, artists, society, on one hand, and dehumanization processes in terms of rethinking the category or the concept of the human through enhancing through the relationship of human towards non-human, what we also just discussed at the end of the previous presentation. And also this initiative that we started together with my colleague Elena Sorokina is in a way trying to understand and refuse, to use the word refusal. I think it's important so that there is a refusal towards the term of new normality. That's why also the title comes, what was happening here was never normal anyway. The title comes from Budur Hassan, a Palestinian writer who was born blind, who is also a researcher and a novelist. And during the pandemics, she wrote that, I quote her in length, "Those of us in so-called 48 region of the Palestine can't visit Arab countries. Many of us make friends online, fall in love online with people we know we can never meet. You develop your coping mechanisms, and this involves imagination. People are now talking about not being able to touch. We've had to imagine that to accept it, that you may never smell or touch someone that you love. At least now with the pandemic, it's temporary. For Palestinians, it's been accepted as an eternity. And we've had to build a whole world through the means of connection, of knowing. In my case, it's been all about building up on voice, because she has no eyesight." And she continues, "We know that we need less travel, that we need to redefine what's essential and what's skilled, who is mournable and who is not, how we have failed those that we should have been protecting. But can you transform this crisis into a springboard for these changes, or will we just return to normal? What was happening here," and she refers obviously to the Palestinian relation, or to Palestinian condition, "was never normal anyway." So I'm going to take on this normality also by quoting another colleague of mine, Edwin Nasser from Beirut, which has, who has been working with Ashkal Alwan, a really important contemporary art center that some of you have visited and worked with, and which has been almost entirely destroyed in the last demonstration. I wish it was a demonstration in the last catastrophe that happened on 4th August. And Edwin was referring to the notion that I have been also, obviously, those that you have been around, you remember that I curated the triennial resilience. And at that time, the resilience has been kind of an up and coming term in relation to sustainability. I have, in a way, kind of embraced it as a politically difficult term, but the way this notion specifically today works in annihilating any kind of political possibility for those that remain alive after the blast in Beirut is precisely by calling them resilience, and those that are on the grounds are actively refusing that term. So he said, he wrote a post on 13th of August saying, aside the initial astonishment of witnessing thousands upon thousands of volunteers cleaning up household debris and outdoor waste in highly affected Beirut neighborhoods following the August 4 massacre, one thing I'm having trouble accepting is the narrative that a presumably spontaneous and politicized we were able to self-organize and take up the role of the state, when in fact it was local and transnational organizations and civic engagement groups with exceptional coordinative abilities and robust funding who were at the core of these initiatives. Why is it that we've come to normalize the inclusion of those groups and organizations within an abstracted we? Because efforts to mobilize youths in providing humanitarian assistance to affected communities has been so successful, there is this current effort to organize them under a framework of oppositional politics that can only lead to victory, provided we continue to deploy the tools and networks civil society actors had themselves activated to bring them down to the streets in the first place. Lebanon's financial and economic crisis and now the 4th August massacre have both served as an impetus for growing dismissals and practices of resilience. But it has become clear that the majority is not interested in dismantling the state and its repressive apparatuses as much as it is interested in performing like one. Why should the burden of rebuilding Beirut fall on us? Where is this collective drive to cover up the scene of a massacre coming from? Are we leaving room to question the operations being conducted on the ground? Which communities are being prioritized over others? What logics of racism and dispossession are being consciously perpetuated? Are we engaging in forms of care and repair, or simply participating in the reinstatement of the business as usual, a return to normalcy most of us already have been traumatized by and made victims by? So I'm starting with a very, just a small but important, I guess, quote. It's from a video of a student of mine who recently started a project with cyanobacteria and themselves as a non-binary person. They produced a video in which this quote comes out, very important quote of Anna Tsing, the anthropologist who wrote the book The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life at the ruins of capitalism, in which it's one of the quotes is the precarity is the state of acknowledgement of our vulnerability to others. And this vulnerability was something that I tried to bring forth in throughout the making of the biennial in Mechelen, Contour Biennial in 2019. And which was for me an important shift in understanding where we can actually operate as curators with good intentions, because it turned out that the institution in which I was intervening, by using my white privilege, being a person as a guest curator in a predominantly white institution that was hosting me, it turned out that although they have been, let's say, authentically interested in my proposals and proposals of the artists into the processes of decolonization, we were specifically talking about Belgium, and its relationship towards the necessity to degrow the society's activities through working on intersections between ecology and decolonization. This institution turned out to be too white, actually, to be able to engage itself the way I wished it would, in that sense that I wished that also with the project there would be an impact onto the infrastructure of the institution itself, on the way it works, the way it perceives itself, the way its public is 99% white, to question its own actually operating. While almost burning myself down through this process, which was open to 3 moments in time that took place over weekends that were aligned with different phases of the moon, because I wanted to underline the connections also obviously between the ecofeminism and decolonization. This kind of comes in this talk as a reminder why and how also in my practice I have tried to not only self-reflect but change the ways I am working. It's just an excerpt from one installation where the artist Sadi Shua put important books that helped her overcome the psychological trauma of being exposed to racism, and she put them into beautiful pot plants and made a whole installation about how to confront and heal the relationships of trauma in the society. And Belgium, as those that live or know well, has many issues still today in confronting its past. While thinking about the present moment in which we have, most of us have been through more or less strict lockdowns in Paris, where I live. It was one of the regions where we had a possibility only to move for 1 kilometer. We could not go beyond it without having the documents. There was also very strict policies in terms of seeing family members or visiting the elders in the elder houses, which Bojana, you referred to as well. And there was this very cynical addresses given by the French President Emmanuel Macron, in which on one hand he declared that we are in a war with the virus, and on the other hand everything was understood as if we all are living in conditions of pure happiness and encounter with our family members that are peaceful, and that we finally have time for each other and to have all this experience of love throughout the lockdown. So very immediately the obvious this incitement that came even as a hashtag, stay at home, it was very clear that it exposed all the social inequalities and increased domestic violence, not only in France but elsewhere. The domestic violence, especially obviously on women and children, increased for 35% in 1 month, or the first month of the lockdown. And those who were unable to stay were of course the racialized minorities. They have been termed through the media as essential workers. So again we have a kind of certain cynical address given to them, knowing that they are performing so-called essential works by being completely underpaid and under extreme stress and having lived in those conditions since very long. It's not just that this became clear during the lockdown itself. It's, as you know well, but I think it's important to name them. These were the supermarket cashiers who were, by the way, in Paris among the first victims who died in the first days after the lockdown. Security personnel, medical staff at the hospitals, public transport workers, truck drivers, post officers, cleaners, delivery workers. The decolonial feminist Françoise Vergès wrote that they all belong to, quote, an entire humanity that the journalists and the scholars seemed to discover. The invisible ones, the little hands, the essentials. The essentials, she says, have been distinguished from the essential, expressing itself sentimentally and enabling to evacuate any inequalities, calling for a return of true values, and this she refers obviously to Macron, completely separated from the conditions in which millions of people are living, and ignoring practices of groups and communities who have managed to emancipate themselves from the consumerist economy by developing modes of living, eating, and caring based on their ancestral knowledge, end of quote. And this proposed concept of the life before as a representation of a certain norm, and the life after as something that is going to be modified into something that is more careful and sensible, however, does not match the reality, Vergès says. Life before 17 March, I quote her again, so this was the official beginning of the confinement in France, has nothing that would be worth accepting it as a norm. Structural racism, economic violence, contempt regarding the class issues, state and civilizational feminism, as she calls it, Islamophobia, anti-migrant laws. And if we remember who has been talking about these caring classes and the classes that have done a lot of care work before, of course, it's the very much missed David Graeber, who should rest in peace and in power. And in his article that has also been shared a lot recently from 2014, Caring Too Much, That's the Curse of the Working Class, he writes that most of the work we do is on each other. The working classes just do a disproportionate share. They are the caring classes and always have been. It is just the incessant demonization directed at the poor by those who benefit from the caring labor that makes it difficult to acknowledge it. And he says, as a child of a working class family, I can attest this is what we were actually proud of. We were constantly being told that work is a virtue in itself, but nobody believed that. Most of us felt work was best avoided, that is, unless it benefited others. But of work that did, whether it meant building bridges or emptying bedpans, you could be rightly proud. And there was something else we were definitely proud of, that we were the kind of people who took care of each other. So we, together with Elena Sorokina, who is a colleague of mine, a curator, who has been working recently a lot with different activist organizations that in Paris that have been working with artists coming either in France, because of the violence taking place in their countries, or through different routes of from the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa. We started to engage in a conversation around the necessity of understanding that obviously the position from which we are speaking and working as curators is a certain position of privilege. We spoke a lot or a little bit about the decentralization of, in the previous discussion about decentralization of the subject of care. And with Elena, we tried to imagine what we could do as curators in the light of the situation, because we kind of, I guess, wanted to bring back the use value into the arts again. And this is also something that we were talking about what is this new purpose of art in the light of the social issues that we are living in. And especially we wanted that this, whatever this would be and whatever our conversations would be turning into, should be deeply part and of the fabric of where are we living. So at that moment in time, this was in April, this was 1 kilometer of what surrounded us in different parts of Paris and beyond. And so we also were very indebted to, there was perhaps you are aware of the Social Text magazine that devoted itself to the question of the critical care. And there was this beautiful understanding or explanation of what the term radical care could mean by the two editors of the Social Text issue from the March 2020 of Hileli Julia Kawehipuka Haupulani Hobart and Tamara Knies, where they understand it as, where they define care as an affective connective tissue, a feeling with rather than a feeling for others. And they say that when care is mobilized, it offers this kind of visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservation that span a breadth of localities, selves, communities, and social worlds. Reciprocity and attentiveness to the inequitable dynamics that characterize our current social landscape represent the kind of care that can radically remake worlds that exceed those offered by the neoliberal or post-neoliberal state, which we already discussed about as well, and which has proved inadequate in its dispensation of care. And understanding that and knowing how we have worked or how we have been actually asked and how we have been required to work as interdependent curators in response to the institutions, I think we wanted to try to, what I referred to in another text that I wrote, we wanted to try to understand what slowness, slowing down in what you are making, in how you are making things would look like. And in this slowing down, it also means that you situate your ways of working and being in the given context over a longer period, because the care or whatever we want to call the relationship that we want to work and establish demands time. It's not something that can happen as an event. At least that's how I see it, at least in the visual art circle. But also on the other hand, it became very clear because we started to form a new initiative that we call Initiative for Practices and Visions of Radical Care for the sake of not having for the moment another name. we decided to work with the artists that we knew already and that who have had histories or experiences of racism, different types of racism, either personal or structural, discrimination or other forms in social oppression, and who have developed important caring practices that they intertwine within their artistic practices, and this since a long time, and as a kind of continuum. Many of the artists that we work with have status of either asylum seekers or refugees, or are coming from the diasporic communities. And they are people of color, queer, identifying as queers, or First Nations, who all are living in or around the Parisian metropole. And they have been, as we discussed with the group, they have been grappling with colonization, subjugation, street violence, and intergenerational trauma throughout most of their lives. In a way, in these communities, how they described us that they have been able to survive was through the acts of love and care. For example, the Afro-Brazilian artist who lives in Paris, Fabiana X. Souza, she says, I'm a product of radical care, because in Brazil, every 20 minutes, a black woman dies. And I have had the possibility to not only come to study in France, but also I survived until now. So she also, in a very interesting way, in order to imagine what could be survival from the conditions from which she's coming, she decided to, she was called Fabiana Souza, and Souza obviously belongs to a name of a slave owner. It's a very common name, as you know, in Brazil. So in 2014, she added X Souza. So now she's called Fabiana X Souza, and she, in that way, started a process of disidentification and liberation, as she calls it. What we did, so we are, you will see at the end, I have one slide, we are doing, in a way, how we are meeting and how we were not meeting during the confinement, but arranging conversations actually through all the platforms that you can imagine that exist and are proliferating. But after the confinement, we started to organize very simple picnic assemblies. So in the sense of assembly, as discussed also by Judith Butler, but more in the getting together, bringing together ourselves. So always we go through different parks, actually, for now in Paris, where we try to every time bring people that we know that have not yet met, and we kind of compose those assemblies in order to open a moment in which any kind of mutual either needs or skills or information, so be it we bring together legal workers, health workers, artists. We talk to each of the artists who then also every time brings somebody else into those assemblies. So this is how we started to operate. So it's completely self-organized and not funded initiative, but one that in a way would like to understand that the caring practices within artistic practice will be that field of arts that will be the most vulnerable and will probably be the less financed in the years to come. So this is also where our motivation came from. So in order to kind of see how to sustain on a longer run something that is very much underrepresented, and this I'm really speaking from the terms of Parisian context, or let's say French context, that is uneventful. I'm talking here about practices such as like Barbara Manzetti, who has been opening up her house to to different asylum seekers and refugees, with whom she then engages into a creative process for long years. Or Fabiana Souza, that I already mentioned, who is working with Afro-Brazilian communities in Paris. But first of all, we borrowed this as a kind of image that guides us. It's a traditional Iraqi, the way it's done, it's this traditional Iraqi textile skill called Yodalea. Holot Hawa, she's currently living between Finland and Jordan with her husband, who had to escape because of political reasons from Iraq. And this for her is an act of continuing having her home with her wherever she moves, because this traditionally covers the furniture in most of places, mostly rural places in Iraq. And the first how we brought from this conversation into one act that was more or less like a solidarity act was that we were in touch with a group of artists who are mostly white, French, American performers, visual artists of certain age. So they were like around between 55 and 65. And quite a lot of them are living in Paris in very good conditions, but have been felt very vulnerable during the lockdown because they lost some of their friends. They work as a group of artists that meets from time to time. But they are mostly single women who live apart from each other and in a way kind of feel uprooted from either their homes in the West, in the Western world, meaning US or where they were coming from mostly. And they, Elena was in touch with them because she knew them from before, and they expressed a need to reconnect because they couldn't visit each other because of the 1 kilometer distance. At the same time, we were, they kind of gave us an idea how would it be if we could perform certain movements in public space that could connect us, at least virtually. So at the same time, we were in touch with École des Actes with Elena. So as some of you know, Marietica, especially, I have worked for 3 years, and Bojana, of course, I have worked for 3 years, and Bojana, in Aubervilliers, which is located in the northeastern suburbs of Paris, one of the more poor towns actually in France, but multiculturally extremely rich. And Théâtre de la Commune, which is the local theater, in 2017 established École des Actes, which is a school that through production of theater performances enables young, precarious, either young precarious teenagers from Aubervilliers who are coming from diasporic communities or refugee, those who have refugee status or asylum seekers, to work on the French language through doing theater productions and being paid at the same time. So it's an important endeavor, and of course during the lockdown the production stopped. Any kind of production that was already taking place have been frozen, and so also the money flow has been frozen for those youngsters. So we thought, like, how could we combine? They were looking for funding. They were looking for, raising awareness about what they are doing. So what we decided to do is to connect those two groups that have never met. So the group Salonistas, who wanted to do something in the public space in order to reconnect, let's say, themselves, and the awareness towards that would gravitate towards the northeast, where the École des Arts is situated. So we, together with those artists, we drew a map. So we kind of said, let's think together of ways of using the 1 hour. So you could have 1 kilometer and 1 hour of being outside. That was the only thing that you could do. Either you went grocery shops or sports, or so we decided that we would tick on our documents that we went for work if we were asked by police. So everybody ticked that they were going to work. And we used the 1 kilometer from our places towards the place where the next person in that group would be living. And people started to reinvent actually the line as a kind of basic, very common, millennium-old means of expression, actually, of visual arts, or let's say also in any kind of thinking. There is always, we talk about red line, we talk about drawing the line, and so the group was starting to do the lines on the pavements in Paris, but in the kind of gravitation towards the north. So I'm just going quickly through that. Mostly it happened with material that would be non-harmful, so either herbs or non-toxic paint that can be easily washed away. Sorry, going here. So in different manners or performed differently, they started drawing this kind of pathway towards the north. Some artists reacted through the means of literally performance, such as Hurami Shekari, who poured kind of colored water into this mask, which is a mask of her face, and which was pouring down, she said, she's an Iranian artist living in exile in Paris. So the mask of her own face was pouring down the tears onto the public space. Or Ismail Afgan, who is an Afghani jewelry maker and artist. He drew out of his, so this is also his, I'm performing his jewelry on myself as well, wherever I go. He has done 1 kilometer actually of the different materials with which he usually works. Les Gens du Terpin, which is a choreographic collective, have drawn a chalk. So this is also, if we are speaking here from Slovenia perspective, it's not without relationship to Tomáš Šalamun and Oho in Novi Sad in '69. And we also referred to, I had one slide before, to a very unique project that was already thinking about certain type of confinement, which was Ida Bjart's project, the Galerie des Locataires, in '72 and '73. Where she, together with Goran Trbuljak, established the French window as a concept in which to intervene in a completely strict and limited way. And we ended with a henna line made by Gaëlle Chouan, a Haitian French artist, who did her line in Normandy. So also the kind of, and who was actually our collaborator from École des Arts, because Gaëlle is a very acclaimed artist who works with École des Arts on doing scenography together with young students of hers. What was the aim? The aim was that we actually managed to raise 5,000 euros for École des Arts at the end, because we were heavily, making this visible through all possible means, so lots of donations took place over the period of 1 week, and it was actually the last period of very strict confinement that we used in order to do this action. At the same time, we understood that for us this was just, in a way, a beginning for understanding of what an interdependent curating could what kind of shape it could have. We also opened a radio antenna. So because of the impossibility of getting together through the means of openings, we have like, there are actually no exhibition openings taking place in Paris or in France at the moment because everything is highly sanitarized. But while this was being taken into the society as a norm, at the same time the Black Lives Matter protests happened in France as well. So we thought that there is something highly suspicious about, on one hand, hyper-disciplinarization of the society and the necessity to really undo and talk about the Black Lives Matter, which in France has become really now, at the moment as I speak, it's not only taking place anymore on academic level or in art institutions, but on a political level. So as I said yesterday I think to Bojana, there is now a speech was given by the president in Panthéon where he was publicly denouncing the so-called separatist turn in French society, for which he claims the responsible are intellectuals, academicians, the creatives that have been talking about the decolonial turn. So so this was our first radio event taking place on a street because we could not meet within. With a collective, the Living and Dead Ensemble, that are from Haiti and who have been confined in Paris, about the logic of hypersanitarization. And at the same time, we are planning to have, because we work with lawyers and health workers, public health workers, because of the singular situations that each of the artists is experiencing. Our next debate will be around the relationship between public health and racism, and this will be talked obviously also with the artists. One other that we are planning is about legal work and care. So in what relationship there is, so legal work as care practice actually, so which happened, for example, in certain institutions in, not only in France, was that during the confinement period there was a lot of legal work that needed to be done in order that people could remain where they were and not being sent back to the countries from where they came. So we are going to bring that forward. And the last thing that is still quite new, but in that sense inspired by the so-called land acknowledgements of either the First Nations do when they start talking, for example, in places that were colonized, or certain institutions that are doing let's say deliberately an act of acknowledgement and an act of solidarity with the First Nations beat. So this is mostly taking place, for example, in Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, in some places in Southern America. But I'm really curious to think about what, how it goes. It says usually we acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I find this such a, it's a performative, but it's a very strong incitation for understanding where is one speaking from. and with one artist that lives in Paris who is from Kanaki, so from New Caledonia and of indigenous ancestry. We are going to delve into trying to see if we could have such an acknowledgement also from the side of art institutions and what that could be in the places of former colonial centers such as France. So this is where I am. Thank you for your listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Maybe now for time for Katja Kobolt, and then we can switch to the discussion. Or so. Katja Kobolt works in the junctures of art, writing, and teaching. Katja has conceptualized and produced numerous art exhibitions and events in different parts of Europe and has been active with a feminist curatorial platform, Red Mind, and Balkanet, a self-organized production platform for migrant art and cultural workers in München.
I would like to thank very much, of course, for the invitation to be able to be here in this very exciting round. Especially, of course, to Alja Lobnik, Priya Bezevšek, Tina Dobnik, Janez Janša, and all of you who made Nataša Božič, who made this event possible. I must admit that as such events require quite a few work and also some kind of advanced timeline, that I wasn't aware that the event is going to tackle the notions of precarity and self-management. But as I propose to share with you some considerations departing from my individual and collaborative curatorial practice, it shouldn't come as a surprise that I actually do speak about precarity and also in some terms, so to say, let's say maybe this is an illusion, but also some possible pragmatic remediations which I guess have the legacy in self-management as an organizing form. Nataša already mentioned that of course, through now, the notion had both notions of precarity and sustainability had some very profound theoretical introduction already at this event. And I would maybe like to attach to what Bojana Kunz proposed, the maintenance as a moment, and maybe also within this maintenance, nevertheless open for the moment of generating. Like for myself, I'm since a decade based in Munich. It's a rich southern province, German province. And in a certain way, before Janez Janša mentioned that from the mid-2000s, so to say, the international scene quite willingly opened to, so to say, drain of the knowledge accumulated through the specific Yugoslav condition in these places. Well, Munich, it's here a bit different city, as it has a very long history of migration from Southern Europe. So basically, I'm talking, or I'm also working in Munich more in from a diasporic position. It's in Munich, the ex-Yugoslav community. It's the largest migrant community. More than almost 100,000 people are currently live in Munich that have roots or are the first generation of migrants as myself in the city. The city itself basically depends on migration. Almost half of the people who populate the city have a migrant background. Nevertheless, even in such a constellation, of course, institutions of art do not reflect the lived diversity in a city. And I must say that, I mean, what I will visually here share with you, but also for some input that I would like to share with you, I must say that the last month of confinement and of saturated or escalated labor that was needed, especially in the sector of, so to say, interdependent production, that was needed as being a parent. It still sits in my bones, and I guess this is also a situation maybe that some of you shares. On the one hand, we just kind of came back to normality in a much more saturated terms. So I would say that within the art sector, so to say, the exclusivity escalated. If we were before as producers under pressure by policymakers that we would need to boost audiences, now there are bans and limits on audiences. So so art, it's becoming more and more also with other sectors, even more exclusive field that it was before the pandemic. Of course, this also, so to say, gives some opportunity if the round gets even smaller for some reconsiderations. So to come back to Munich, because this is kind of a background that I'm talking from, and in comparison also with the context where I was in artistic terms socialized, which were 1990s and 2000s Ljubljana. The situation in Munich, by whom, for whom, and what art is produced, and how this art constitutes the spaces and institutions of art, differs quite from what I would position as a so to say post-Yugoslav legacy. I still think that it's very valid, and not only valid but also productive, to what I think that a couple of institutions in Slovenia basically go this way, to kind of develop or working in front of the background of nevertheless imagined, but the background of the concept of Yugoslav art and the legacies. I mean, it's obvious that even within contemporary production, there is a base to talk and to conceptualize and to approach the practice from the concept of Yugoslav art. However, despite the differences in ideologies, in aesthetics, and partly production processes, the production and representation of art has been grounded on, for example, in Ljubljana as a post-Yugoslav context, and Munich as a Western post-Cold War city. There are, of course, plenty of converging points from the current cultural policy promoting creative industries, and this in a time where, when even Richard Florida, who forged this neoliberal exploitation model of arts and culture, is partly withdrawing from it. So one could say that before, Florida was making money by promoting creative industries, and now he's making money by partly withdrawing his position, but the accent here is on partly, of course. Another point of convergence would be quite national exclusiveness, or for the best internationality or international understanding of art and running of institutions of art and knowledge. Because internationality, I think it's a lot of times mistaken with lived diversity, especially in contexts where, for example, Berlin, there is really like saturated international atmosphere, whereas peripheric cities, of course, so to say, have some lived diversity and are more basically confronted with the question of representation of and articulation also of what Nataša called essential workers, maze, which is racialized, ethnicized, classicized, and feminized. So, I mean, this is what I would like to kind of share with you, some considerations on these exclusion and inclusion mechanisms that are at work, in my observation, in the timed spaces called art, especially, as I said, in front of the case study Munich, so to say. I would say that within the pandemic, of course, these are very practical questions that we all were working on, that work in some kind of creation of timed spaces, like what kind of shared, curated timed spaces are possible, digital and physical, and also what kind of togetherness, what kind of sociability arises or could arise in and from them. I think that even more important question is, though, how are we to change our practices as producers in a way to work against the reoccurrence of such pandemics that obviously saturate and escalate the inequalities that the med measures against the disease have only escalated. If yesterday at the discussion, Bojana Cvejić, Mala Klenen, Bojana Kunst, if their questions were more focused upon what different performance practices do for or with audiences, like what are, so to say, the moments of opening the forum for different inhabiting of the mutual timed space. I more, so to say, turn the questioning more in Benjamin terms towards the production processes, which has, of course, also it has a reason due to working lately more in visual arts. So it's in these terms also the habitualized space and choreography within an exhibition space. It's of course quite different from a space of event within performance art. There are, I mean, I especially together with the collective Red Mind, we kind of worked productively exactly at this point. But this is, as I said, I will more go into production. Today, the one quote I would like to share with you, Tomislav Medak said today, or claimed, or made himself strong for limits and, so to say, delineation. This is another completely different approach. It's a One Health approach with which, so to say, the dependence between different beings, not here regarding the diseases, especially it's articulated. It's a quote that I have taken from Robert Koch Institute webpage. This is German central governmental institution for protection of public health. Here now only on the side, their name giver, Robert Koch, was affiliated with the German colonial project and was carrying out experiments on the colonized people in East Africa. And of course this not only within medical knowledge, but also of course within art, as a space of knowledge generation and knowledge conversation and putting forward of the knowledge. We of course also, so to say, this field has of course also a lot to do with the legacy of colonization. And I think that it's important before I tackle this aspect of, so to say, the legacies of colonization, which is, I think, even in peripheric territories that themselves, so to say, were to a certain extent colonial projects, or were, so to say, a part of imperial aspires of centers that were located outside of the territory, which is, of course, the territory of the Balkans. Nevertheless, as I already proposed today, of course, it's within the concept of modernity that, so to say, we within the post-Yugoslav legacy, so to say, need to confront. Colonization is not excluded. I mean, today was already Bojana Kunst mentioned Yugoslavia and the extreme repatrialization that basically was taking place already in the Yugoslav context since the abolition of Antifascistična Fronta žena in 51, but also if we take, if we look at how Yugoslav project was implemented at Kosovo or within Romani population and so forth. So I think that it would be a fallacy to relate to colonialism as something we within the periphery are excluded from. Last but not least is of course the immense colonial, immense continental epistemology that we basically base on, and it's so to say product of these processes. The re-questioning, I think, like how we could make it different when producing art, I think that it needs to go hand in hand with self-questioning of the positioning of ourselves within the structural reproduction of the state of emergency that has been perpetuated for a long time to finally come back home from where it was, so to say, exported, the tiny little area called Europe, however, with immense desire for continentality. This tiny little area has, of course, so long imagined itself for the cradle of so-called humankind. And I think that this reconsideration needs to pay attention, even if one speaks or thinks or acts from a marginal position, what would be a diasporic position or interdependent position. It must, so to say, involve this checking on the subjectivity, interpersonal, institutional, but also systemic production level. Renata Salezel once tackled as the paradox of contemporary Western societies that we are constantly talking about ethics, and exactly this never drying up locution gives us a dispensation from what really needs to be changed. So the question how we could make the step from, so the question is how we could make the step from from ethics to politics. How could we bring trouble into trouble when we are actually a part of the trouble? In the lockdown, I was very happy to read the text by Paul B. Preciado, Learning from the Virus, in which Paul Preciado, so to say, among other things, really insists on, so to say, detaching from the forced telecommuting or imposed telecommuting paradigm or interpellation of everything, so to say, going online. And other ways, also physical and digital control, for which, so they claim, the purpose is the decollectivization, including the relation with the so-called natural environment. And this has today already been mentioned by Nataša, that the measures of protection have been mostly imposed over the privileged human bodies in isolation, while classicized, ethnicized, racialized, and feminized bodies were, so to say, loaded with multiple burdens of work to keep the system relevant aspects running. And it is exactly the relation between these two groups that it's also the line of demarcation of much of the art institutions. So exactly the group who needs to be activated in terms that the first group can be protected. It's as a rule also are as a rule groups that are, so to say, left aside the institutions of production and representation of knowledge and art. The recent attempts, at least within German context, the recent attempts for diversification of the institutions of art, unfortunately, seldomly undo sample diversification by occasionally sending out invitations to diverse audiences or including sample others, so to say, within institutions. I mean, in the best case are these so-called audience building programs or capacity building inclusion programs, which on the one hand base the two-way transfer on quite an equal ground in terms of production, while the diverse participants, even if they are included into production process, bring their situated knowledge and capacities. They are, as a rule, included on very precarious grounds, while the facilitators of this opening of the institutions are, of course, belong to the first group, have permanent contracts, and so forth. And of course, the problem is, which is also a problem that Ljubljana encounters. These are like festivals of eruptions of sudden opening, from which institutions, so to say, get dispensation from that anything really structural-wise need to change, they are, so to say, like a FIGO list somehow. Of course, I have today, here is not the time that I kind of declinate through, like, what in my eyes, or like from what in my experience as a practitioner could be a possible remedy, so to say, or what we as producers need to detach from within the production process in order, or de-alienate from, in order to collectivize and be together in not controlled ways. But there are like three aspects that I would like to share with you, and like the first two would be market rationality and the genius. On this year's Mother's Day, an artist friend of mine has sent me a link to Art Basel conversation, which took place 2019, where Julieta Aranda invited artists, all working mothers in the top of the art world, to discuss the issue being a mother within the art world. And Coco Fusco opened the discussion with an observation that the art world is a sector which prides itself on being filled with educated, liberal, enlightened people, but is actually, as a labor sector, quite hypocritical, in that is entirely unregulated, and that people speak one way and act in another way, and that they basically naturalize a structure which is totally disadvantageous to women who parent. The panelists underlined that being a parent and working in arts is something mainly connected to money. So in a sense, one needs to have lots of money to be able to pay other people to care for one's own child. So one herself could work in the arts. And what was also repeatedly claimed is that artistic labor should not be affected by parenting. This argument came up in the course of the conversation a couple of times, as if women, all mothers, had once again to prove that their devotion to art has not suffered due to them being mothers. The genius needs to have material and habitual preconditions to be completely absorbed by art. Unless she's not a genius, she's not an artist. You would not believe, but not so long ago, is this here? Do I have it? No. Obviously, this one is missing. Not so long ago, Thomas Hirsch commented on the subject of doing art politically with the following words. As an artist, one must be totally committed to one's artwork. There is no other possibility than total commitment if one wants to achieve something with one's art. This is true for any art. And this was like commenting doing art politically. To come back to the conversation between the artists' mothers. Through the discussion, it became clear that there is, even within critical art discourse, one strikingly perpetuating blind spot, and this is market rationality as the central structure and vehicle of more or less all the aspects of the art system and also other fields of knowledge production. If some of you is engaged with academia, then you surely you have a lot to tell about the current neoliberalization or the second wave of the neoliberalization taking place right now within research. Market rationality as the current hegemonic relation towards the living and non-living matter. Here I walk along Donna Haraway and her observation that the epoch we live in, it's not structured by anthropos, but by the capital. Haraway objects the exceptionality of the human for so many centuries, a fundamental proposition also within the supposedly exceptional field of art, as a result of autopoietic, self-making man made in the image of a vanished god, taking on superpowers in his secular sacred ascent. For the most part, Haraway also reminds us that, again, that colonization, indigenous genocides, and slavery with their labor innovations and relocations of humans, animals, and plants have been the main engines for the extreme devastating impact on all living and non-living matter. Is this in the name of the anthropos? If yes, then only in the name of very few samples of the species anthropos, rather in the name of the capital. That's why also capital, that's why also Haraway argues for the notation capitalocene against anthropocene. Within the market rationality, all life, including thinking, affecting, and by that also art making, curating, and togetherness that arises out of them should be a subject to capital reproduction. Of course, as I said, here is not enough time that I declinate all, but I think that one of them should be named one of the tools of the market rationality, and this is nationalism. We all know that the pandemic, so to say, that the pandemic lured the nation state which stubbornly stayed the model of governance, even in a globalized surveillance capitalist condition. It's basically the pandemic lord. It's consolidated a mode of governance with intersections of biopolitical tools and massive private interest. And at the same time, this nation state, relatively young European phenomena, has still provided, so to say, a framework. Now we're talking about art institutions, and the imagination of the nation. It's still one of the, I would say, most prevailing structural mechanisms or epistemological basis that prevails in the institutions of art and other knowledge production. One needs only to think on the plethora of studies within art history that has this specific focus, which is completely artificial, not paying attention to the educational, production, reception contexts, the means of production. It's a completely, so to say, within the research, like a lens which is very narrow, and you know, this is what you want, this is what you get, kind of principle. And still, I think that nationalism and the way that art institutions work, I can hear speak, of course, mostly for Germany and Slovenia. It's still, so to say, this machine of exclusive inclusion or exclusive homogenization, and at the same time the machine for the production of otherness. And what we can learn from the socialist, from the feminist, from the anti-racist and migrant movements is that, of course, institutions are not bodiless. They are structured by the bodies that inhabit and the choreographies that inhabit. And these are, so to say, constitutive moments for the institutions themselves. I would like to share with you now, finally, before I close very pragmatically, two initiatives within the German-speaking context. One is the initiative "We Are Sick of It," that protested in a campaign-wise very loudly towards the injustice, so to say, or the failures of public art institutions in Germany. And the other one is the anonymous collective Dear All, who recently protested with an open letter to Munich City Council. They were the organizers of a symposium which is in Munich. They are now for since 2013 taking place larger art in public space events, called a space called Public, by now curated the first edition by Elmgren and Drexet, the second edition 2018 curated by Joanna Varsha. And in the course of this, so to say, city art cultural project, there was a symposium asking question to whom belongs the city. and none of the panelists invited to the symposium could actually, was there actually that would represent the lived diversity of the city. So it's obvious to whom, so to say, the city belongs. Do I still have some 5 minutes or little? Then I will leave this only maybe on the side. Very dear anthology, Anti-Racist Curating, edited by Nathalie Bayer, Nora Sternfeld, and Belinda Kozinski, I think is her name. In this anthology, Nuray Demir comments or elaborates on one research project of her in which she was searching within the Lipperheide Costume Library, which is a Berlin-based archive, and she found a photo of, in the modern dance box, she found a photo of a white dancer costumed as a belly dancer, while she found another photo of a black woman dressed as a belly dancer in the exotic box. So why I'm telling this is only that the notions, the tools with which we approach, whether as curators or as researchers or as critics, they are not, they are of course situated notions, so to say that again reproduce the exclusion or the reproduction of this very Vitruvian still image of what the embodiment of an enlightened body that should inhabit the institution of art and knowledge, should look like, behave like, and think like. Well, I guess what I said, I guess it's not so new to you. Within the Maska editions, there is one edition also by Robert Fahler on interpassivity theory. I guess that we are quite acquainted with the aspects that I was sharing with you today, but still, like, the question is that, you know, how come that nothing changes if we are so kosher in our minds, so to say. So here I come to my promised Benjamin turn. So in my eyes, but this is also, of course, speaking from this described situated position, if art production and curating are to bring trouble into the hegemonic modes of societal production, scarce with trouble, it's about dehabitualizing of the habitual. So it's about taking time for mutual recognition of togetherness, but also of antagonisms. It's about non-hierarchical structure, or at least floating hierarchies where all involved in the production process can have a space for loud articulation, for creativity. It is about accountability towards the others and towards one's own actions and words. It's accountability towards the invisible aspects of works usually done by the ones who anyway enter the production process from precarious positions, and while they are doing their actual work, within the production, they usually need also, so to say, this invisible work of educating the others on through their situated knowledge on the real situations that are, so to say, hegemonic events that always pop up within this process. And I think that it's really, that's why as an undertitle, I think it's really about, so to say, bringing trouble into production process, which should not be smooth at all, because I think that art is not a thing. I think that art is a relation in production. So in these terms, we can, of course, pragmatically start from horizontal payment to the organization. For example, if working with performance and arts, we are constantly producing scenographies, exhibition architectures that are constantly being destroyed. So no furniture storage, so to say, where we could then share, but always, so to say, always starting from this ex nihilo, so to say, a moment. So yes, I would very much, so to say, pledirala that we turn to the aspects in which we encounter ourselves as producers, as co-producers, as human beings within the planetary belonging. So much. Thank you.